All right, so this morning we're going to be talking about Genesis 33 and 34. Of course, we talked about Genesis 32 last week, so does anyone remember what happened in Genesis 32? What were some of the major events? Who is Jacob getting ready to meet in Genesis 33? That's right, his long-lost brother Esau. Now, is Jacob looking forward to this meeting? How did they part ways the last time? What was the attitude like? Yeah, whenever you have to meet someone that said kind of the last words out of their mouth, next time I see you, I'm going to kill you, that generally doesn't go very well. Esau he said that he wanted to kill Jacob, and that was because he stole the birthright, right? He went in disguised as Esau. Isaac had poor eyesight. He didn't realize that it was Jacob. He thought it was Esau, and ultimately gave the birthright over to Jacob. So we see that happening. We also know from Genesis 32 that Jacob sent gifts over to Esau to try to lighten his mood a little bit. And Jacob also wrestles with God, right? He wrestles with an angel. And ultimately, we see in Genesis 32 that his name is changed to Israel. And we'll see next week in Genesis 35 where that is also confirmed at Bethel. But this is really the background that we have over to Genesis 33. So we will begin looking at Genesis 33 this morning. We'll begin looking at we're about to skip some slides. I'm sorry about that. We'll begin looking at verse 1, and I'll begin reading at verse 1 and read through verse 11 of Genesis 33. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 female servants. And he put the servants with their children in front, then Leah with her children, and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise with her children drew near and bowed down. And last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob answered, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. So we see here a couple interesting things in these first few verses. We see Jacob has a little bit of a plan as he's going to meet with Esau. What does he do before he meets with Esau? Yes, that's right. And when I saw that, I couldn't help but fast forward a couple chapters in my head to Joseph and the coat of many colors. Like, Joseph being the favorite, I don't think was something that just happened there in that one chapter. Like, this was something that was happening an event before. We definitely see here that he is arranging his people in order of importance, where he's putting the servants and their kids first, Leah, and then ultimately Rachel and Joseph in the back. So I thought that was very interesting. He also goes out and he bows himself down, which I also thought was interesting because, of course, when they last met, Jacob had the birthright. He had the superior promise, but yet he's still prostrating himself before Esau, before they meet. And the next point I have on there is that Jacob and Esau, of course, finally meet, and the reception's actually good. They run forward, they hug each other, there's weeping. Definitely not, the killing that Jacob was probably fearing did not occur, even though Esau had 400 men. Like, everything played out well, and Jacob was blessed through this encounter. We also see that there is a push in the latter verses that we read for Esau to receive the gift that Jacob had sent over to him, and Esau's like, "No, I have enough," but Jacob is pushing. I think that this was covered some in the last quarter. I think I saw this on an online class. Why do you think that there would have been such a big push from Jacob for Esau to accept that gift? Kind of the act of gift giving. What did that mean if they accepted a gift? Forgiveness, yes. Definitely almost like a sense of, you took something from me, so now we're good, kind of an attitude, right? So this could be similar kind of with what we saw with Laban, in some ways building the covenant between Laban and Jacob. Jacob trying to give this over to Esau to make sure that they're good, if you will, using common vernacular. But any thoughts or questions on verses 1 through 11 of Genesis 33? Yes?
We're not told how much livestock or whatever the blessing from Isaac was, or like the birthright, both that Jacob kind of stole from Esau. So, but it is interesting, like how much Jacob is giving back to Esau, like you're saying, to kind of almost make it even, but also like now Esau is getting a blessing from Jacob, which he took from him. Like Jacob has to give it all back.
That's right. And another thing kind of off your point, too, that I think is interesting is we see that obviously Jacob did get the birthright. He got the better blessing. Isaac did bless Esau as well. And we see here that God, in turn, is blessing Esau as well. So Esau's not doing badly over these 20 years. He's doing very well. But any other thoughts or comments on those first 11 verses before we move on? Yes?
You might assume from reading that the motivation for giving of the gift changes slightly, right? So at first here's all, he's clearly, here you go.
Mm-hmm.
Please don't do what you said you were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's clear that he's not going to kill him. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So he reflects on that and says, I see your face as one sees the face of God, right? Which I assume would be with fear and trepidation.
Yeah.
And you received me, right? So no, please. So maybe that motivation has changed.
That's a good point, and I hadn't considered that maybe in that first giving, it was fear that was driving him, but now that he's seen Esau, they've had this moment where they've cried and they've talked. Now maybe he is giving it just out of genuine love. Any other thoughts or comments on verses 1 through 11? Kenny?
I've always found this interesting that they changed his name, but they continued to call Jacob throughout the entire
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And what's funny is I cleared my voice and my voice got worse. So that's not a great thing. But I do think that's interesting. And what's funny is it's almost like Jacob gets his name changed twice, because you have it happen once in 32 where he gets the blessing from wrestling, and then you have it like confirmed again in 35, which is also very interesting to me. I know. Some things are just hard to shake. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and move on to verses 12 through 19. I find these verses very interesting. And I will say this too, whenever you're studying Jacob, I always kind of look at Jacob, he has this trickster kind of way about him where he does things. And I think we see this being shown to us again in verses 12 through 19. So let's begin reading there. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go ahead of you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly, at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." So Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." But he said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore the name of this place is called Succoth. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way to Padan Aram. And he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. So there's some interesting points here. I want to quickly direct your attention to the map. Hopefully that's big enough. I'm not sure. I also don't know if this has a laser pointer. So the green button? Perfect. Thank you, Josh. Peniel, right here. This is where we're having this meeting. This is where the wrestling match happened. Ultimately, we see Jacob saying, "I'll go back with you to Seir," which is down here. This is where Esau is wanting to go. And then we promptly see, after Esau leaves, Jacob going the exact opposite way, over to Succoth, over to Shechem. So I find that very interesting that he's having this conversation with Esau. Even though Esau has invited Jacob to join him, he's still like going a different way. And I was wondering like why you think that might be the case. Does anyone have any thoughts about why you think, and this is all speculation, why would Jacob go the exact opposite way after he's talking to Esau about going with him?
He has livestock.
Yes, that's exactly what he says, is he has livestock and kids. It's a long journey. Yes.
I think he's still fearsome. I think he's still very, very afraid that his brother might try to do something with him, especially he's got 400 men that he gave to him under his
Yeah.
command. And he doesn't want anything to do with that. He's just going to go the other way and just say, I'm going to be done with this and have a nice day.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. And, I've stood up here before when everybody's in this room, and, you've got 400 people in the room. That's very intimidating. To some degree, I do wonder if maybe Jacob is still a little bit afraid of Esau, even after all this, that maybe, this first meeting was nice, but maybe once we get back home, that's when he's going to attack me and do something. We don't know. That's all speculation, but I wonder those things. I will also point out, I believe it's in verse 18 through 20, notice where Jacob is setting up camp. So he spent some time in Succoth, and then he goes over to Shechem. And he does a couple things in Shechem that I think are interesting. One, he actually buys a plot of land, which I think indicates he wanted to stay there for some time. But notice who he buys this from, because they're going to play a role in chapter 34 when we get there in a minute. He ultimately buys it from Hamor, Shechem's father, right? So we already have this mention of Shechem. So to clarify this, Shechem is the name of the city, but Shechem's also the name of a person, which we will delve into in more detail in Genesis 34. But any thoughts or comments on this section before we move on to Genesis 34? Yes?
I think this is the first time that Jacob has kind of claimed God. We see, back when he has the dream before the wrestling, that he's like, if God will be with me, then he will be my God. You have in this, he's claimed God by naming the altar the God of Israel.
Yeah.
And it's really, it almost seems like some kind of turning point in his life where it's kind of staking the ground. But I just find it really interesting that this is where he's chosen to make that claim, or that's at least where we're told that he's first making this claim of, okay, God, Yahweh God is my God.
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting, I guess, that why here?
And that is interesting to me too, because when you think about it, like where did God first appear to Jacob? It would have been in Bethel, right, where he's going to go back in 35. So it's interesting to me that he's stopping in this location. And this location does have some significance in the Bible. This isn't the only time it's mentioned. In Genesis 12:6, Abram stops there on his way down to Hebron. I believe it was in Joshua 24. Joshua addresses the people in Shechem when he gives the "As for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord" speech. So this is not just, a small place on the map in the history of time. Like Shechem, a lot of major things happen there. But it is interesting to me that Jacob seems to have set up shop here in Shechem, which is obviously at this time a Canaanite town. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? All right. We're going to take a brief aside before we get into Genesis 34 and talk about what I have dubbed the golden ticket effect. So if you're familiar with one of the best movies of all time, 53 years old, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie Bucket is this down-on-his-luck kid, and he just wants to get this golden ticket so bad. There's only 5 golden tickets out there, gets you a free tour for the Chocolate Factory, and it gets you all the chocolate that you can eat for your entire life. And he finally gets one. And you would think, like, once he gets this ticket, like, all of his problems would just disappear, and everything would be great. But they're not. Like, all the ticket holders have problems. They have these things they've got to fight through. It's almost like more problems come about because he has the ticket than if he didn't have the ticket, right? And as we get to Genesis 34, I can't help but think of this to some extent. When we think about Jacob's life, up to this point, Jacob's been very blessed. He's gotten out of a lot of things that he really feared, right? He got out of the Laban situation. He got out of Esau. He got the birthright. Like, all these things have worked out for him really well. But that does not mean that he's immune to problems. It does not mean that he's immune to bad things happening. And when I was thinking about this, I was also thinking about our own lives, right? Just like Jacob is in a covenant relationship with God here and something bad still happens, we as Christians are in a covenant relationship with God. And just because we're Christians and we have that golden ticket, that hope of salvation, the home in heaven, does not mean that we're immune to bad things happening in our lives. So I think as we start looking at Genesis 34, I think that's something really important to consider as we think about why Genesis 34 is even here, is just because you're in a covenant relationship with God doesn't mean that life here on earth is always going to be sunshine and rainbows. I'm not going to ask for thoughts or questions on that because no one expected to see Charlie Bucket this morning. We will go ahead and get into the meat of the text this morning, which is going to be Genesis 34. So you probably have different headings in your Bibles for what Genesis 34 is, but if the heading doesn't give it away, this is ultimately going to be the rape of Dinah, Jacob's daughter, and also the vengeance of Jacob's sons on the people. Beginning in verse 1. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl for my wife." So a couple of points from this as we start getting into this. There is a question some might have, is Dinah the only daughter that Jacob has? Because sometimes in genealogies, daughters get dropped off and they're not included. For the sake of this discussion and for the sake of the text, Dinah is the only listed daughter of Jacob. So that's how we're going to go forward with this, is that Dinah is the only daughter of Jacob. There's another interesting thing that I read. As you get on the internet and start reading, you see all sorts of stuff. But some people, based on Genesis 30, when Leah's mentioned as being born, try to calculate into what age Dinah is when all this occurs. The high range that I saw was around 16. The low end of the range that I saw was like younger than 10. So just to give some context to Dinah here and what's going on. And remember, Shechem's a Canaanite town. This is not a place filled with, Yahweh-fearing people. This is a Canaanite town that Jacob has set up next to. And ultimately, we see Shechem doing what he does, which is rape Dinah, and then after the fact, ask Hamor to get her as his wife. So, bleak 4 verses. Does anyone have any comments on what happens in the first 4 verses? Yes?
As far as I think the text says anyway, the last time anyone from this family bought land was Abraham buying the cave, right?
I think that's right.
And what's interesting is immediately what follows on that is Abraham says, I don't want a bride for Isaac, for my son, from anyone in this land. And so we see Jacob buying some land, and then it's like really bad foreshadowing that like the immediate next verse is talking about people visiting the daughters of the land, and then like, a man from the
Yeah.
lands of the land comes. It's like, that's an interesting verse. Like, it's really bad foreshadowing. We see somebody buy land, and then immediately we know what's coming next.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other thoughts or comments on this? And I do really rely on people pointing to people with comments because sometimes I just look right over them. Steve?
I feel really bad for not calling on people last week, but they were supposed to be pilgrims and sojourners. He decides to settle in the land and buy a piece of property. This situation goes so bad that he has to leave town and do what God told him to do anyway, which was travel around because everybody hates him.
Yep.
So God's will is going to be accomplished one way or the other.
And we see in going back to Genesis 31:3, when he's told to leave Laban's house, he's told, go back to your family, go back to the land that I promised you. I don't think this is that land. I think that he needed to go down further, and he didn't do it. Any other thoughts or comments on this? All right, let's go. So whenever you look up Jacob Bible, just you search that term in Google, this picture is in like the top 10. I don't like this picture, but I thought I would put it on here just so you guys had to see it, because every time I look for Jacob pictures, I had to see this picture. It's just something about it. I don't know. I'm going to read verses 5 through 17 now to get us further along in the story. Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. That's never happened to me before. Apologize for that. If you want to see the dead wasp that just flew at me, you can come look at it on the podium after class. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. The sons of Jacob had come in from the field, and as soon as they heard of it, and the men were indignant and very angry, because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. For such a thing must not be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to me to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, and get property in it. Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price and gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife. The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, we cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves, and we will dwell with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. So there's a lot going on in these verses. There's some details that I wish we had that we just simply don't. We see Jacob finding out the news, and he holds his peace until his family returns, his sons return. One question I had is, where's Jacob in verses 8 through 17? Because we don't see a lot of dialogue from him. We don't see Jacob being the one that's responding to Hamor. We don't see Jacob really taking the lead and directing this conversation very much. And I looked once again online, read some different things. I think the most likely solution here is that the way this is written is so that we know that this deception that occurs using God's covenant, God's sign of the covenant, which we'll talk about in a minute, that is clearly the sons of Jacob's idea. This is not Jacob's idea. This is not his plan. So I think that's why he's not mentioned. Some people speculated maybe this is just emotional trauma. Maybe he's in shock. Maybe he's angry. He's trying to control his emotions. Don't know. What we do know is in verse 30, which we'll get to in a little bit, that he's obviously afraid of the people in the land. That he's obviously afraid that by angering the people of the land, both he and his family are going to get wiped out. So that is probably playing into Jacob kind of checking out of this a little bit. But ultimately, Jacob delegates the rights to determine what ends up happening here, it seems, to his sons, which I think is very interesting. I want to talk about a few more points, and then I'll open it up for comments, because I think that there are definitely probably going to be some comments on this section. We see deceit entering the picture from who? Who is deceitful this time? That's right. It's the sons of Jacob. So it's coming full circle, right? We've seen Jacob be deceitful with others. We saw Rachel being deceitful with Laban. Now we see the sons being deceitful. So we see this all through the family, this deceit, just carrying through. I also had a note on here about manslaughter versus murder. So I don't know if you're big on crime dramas or know the difference between the two, but if you Google it, and you're going off Google, I'm not a lawyer, I have no business talking about this, I guess, but manslaughter is when you kill someone accidentally or it just happens in the moment. Murder is when you premeditate it. You plan ahead for it to happen. And I think that's what we have going on here with the mention of it being deceitful, is that the sons of Judah had this plan to murder these people, and this was the means by which they were going to do it. So this is not just something in the spur of the moment. This is not something that seems to be in direct correlation with the crime necessarily. It's something that they premeditated to do. The last point I'll make, and then I'll open it up, is circumcision itself. So circumcision, what is the purpose of circumcision? Not what is it, what is the purpose? It's the sign of the covenant between you and God. And a lot of the lingo going back between these guys, they're not saying, hey, you will be circumcised and be part of the covenant we have with God, but they are talking about, we'll give our daughters and you'll give your daughters and we'll become one people. It's almost seeming like they're implying like you will be part of the covenant with God, which I think is interesting, that the way that they're going about doing this, the way they're going about to attack this presumably stronger force, is using the sign of the covenant with God, which I think is another area where they've gone wrong with this. But very interesting few verses. Any comments or questions on any of this? Yes.
I guess it's the 20th/21st century individual in me, but the sheer violence against women in this passage, in all of the passage, because it's not just the rape of Dinah, but it's also as the sons of Jacob go to plunder the city, they take out the little ones and the women. They're treated like property.
Yep.
And that is so striking to me versus what we know in our own society today. It's almost impossible for us to fathom how women are treated in this society, because we don't treat them as in our own society, we don't treat them that way. They're treated as equals, at least, for the most of us. And it's difficult for me to conceive of what's going on here in some capacity. Dinah's raped, and then Jacob turns around and cuts a deal to make him the man's wife. That wouldn't be done in our modern society.
Yeah.
It's just unspeakable. And then when Jacob's sons act deceitfully and they go in and they slaughter the people of the city, they take the women and they throw down. Something else, again, that wouldn't be done in our society, and I don't think in the modern world. So you have to look at this through a lens of people who view women almost as property. And then when you look at it through that lens, you begin to see that the men are just trying to cut a deal to get themselves to look as good as they possibly can and get out of the situation as good as they possibly can. Jacob's sons obviously want revenge.
Yeah.
And they act in any way possible, even ungodly, deceitfully, to do it. But at the same time, you have the women who are just the pure victims here. And I think sometimes when we go through a passage like this, we gloss over that. That there are souls, women, who are just completely glossed over as the true victims of this entire situation because they have no agency in this society. They're completely powerless.
Yeah. Yes.
You brought up the deceit aspect of this is now Jacob's sons deceiving, and I can't help but wonder if this is the first time he's going to reflect on realizing his deceit in all these other situations didn't just who it actually affected.
Yeah.
It's much more broad, and it's not just yourself either that benefits or fails. But I can't help but think when he deceived his father, him experiencing the other side of that, the father's impact on how Isaac felt when he learned that he had been deceived, and the frustration and anger, and that coming full circle for Jacob, being on the other side of the deceit as well, and what that would have been like for him.
That's right. And the sons are going to deceive Jacob again. This is not the only time, right? Like this, there's another big one coming later about Joseph and what happens with him. And when I think about this, I can't help but think, and I mentioned it a couple classes ago, like my own kids, right? I do things and then I see my kids doing them. It's obviously we have impact over people around us, but definitely if we have children, like we have a significant impact on them. And I can't help but think, like, it's very sobering to think if your bad habits are turning up in your kids, like when that day comes, like that's just very sobering. Kenny.
There's it's difficult for us to basically take our modern sensibilities and objective here. I mean, definitely Dinah is treated really poorly, but also think about the other men of Shechem who were not guilty of the crime that the sons of Shechem did. And because I'm guessing there were a lot of people who were killed who didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that I would say is Jacob and Esau are big in our eyes because these are the only stories that we have. But I imagine these are people who most people around that era would not know. That these are insignificant people in insignificant lands that to most people were doing insignificant things. You think about Israel at its height is going to be a country that is not that important on the national scene, on the international scene. The only thing that made these nations great, these peoples great, was the God that was behind them, not the people themselves. And I think one of the, there's a reason that Jacob and his sons were called cops, because there was no police force to do anything.
There is that, yeah.
There was no legal anything. This is basically a society where in many ways, if you have it, it's yours, and might makes right. And we are, we can talk about the legal system today. We're only one or two steps away from exactly the same thing. And so I think one of the things that I worry about is us taking modern sensibilities and putting it on this story. And so I think about today.
And I will mention too, on the modern sensibilities thing, like once again, bringing it back to my own situation. Like I have 3 daughters, it's hard not to read this and think, well, if this was one of my kids, what would I do? It would be bad probably. I don't think I would handle it very well, from the way Jacob, what we do have recorded from Jacob, his concern seems to be very centered on just maintaining the lives of everyone in his family, because there is no police, there is no military. It's kind of every man for himself in this situation.
Well, the other thing is, this doesn't go unnoticed by God and the blessing in Genesis 49. Reuben's going to be, it should be Reuben, the firstborn, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Reuben's disqualified, Simeon and Levi are disqualified because of this in their code. And
Yeah.
Judah then becomes the holder of the birthright, which he shouldn't have had, yet it is the seed which through Christ has been come through.
That's right. Any other questions before we move on? Or comments, rather? Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to 18 through 29. Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem. And the young man did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, These men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us to become one people, when every male among us is circumcised, as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us. And all who went out of the gate of his city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem. And every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. On the 3rd day, when they were sore, 2 of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and whatever was in their city and in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, all that was in the houses they captured and plundered. So ultimately we see here Shechem and Hamor go back to the city and they convince the whole town that getting circumcised to become one with this people is the right thing to do. We see in verses 21 through 23 that they do mention like the wealth. They mention how, why would you do this, men of Shechem? Like, why would you make this decision? Well, they've got all this stuff, and all this stuff can be ours if we all just do this one little thing. And ultimately, we see that's when the 2 brothers, Simeon and Levi, come upon the city and attack it. What I do think is interesting here is, of course, you could argue maybe Joseph would be a half-brother of Dinah. Simeon and Levi are blood brothers of Dinah. They are descendants of Leah as well. But they come against the city, they attack it. I did have a note here that I thought was interesting, that Dinah was still there. I don't know if Dinah was there the whole time, if maybe Dinah had come back for a while, and then once they had reached the agreement, Dinah went back with Shechem and Hamor. Not really sure, but Dinah was in the city when it was attacked. And ultimately, they take everything from the city. They take the animals, they take the wives, they take the kids, they take everything, and ultimately go back home after that's done. Any thoughts or questions on this before we move on? Yes?
Not to get into Steve's material next week, but
Mm-hmm.
I care.
Yeah.
But this whole principle of Jacob and his family being immersed in Canaanite culture, and of course now they're taking, the women of Shechem for themselves. But you get to chapter 35, and as Jacob is going to make his way back to Bethel, where God has blessed him, he has to say to his family, put away your foreign gods. That has
Yeah.
brought that into his house.
That's right. And I can't help but think, too, when we read the story, and I think about Lot, too. Lot looked at the land. He was like, oh, this land's clearly better. And he goes and sets up next to Sodom and Gomorrah. And even when the city's being destroyed and he's trying to get his family out, they won't come because they're so seeped into the culture of those cities. I don't want to say don't live in a big city. That's obviously not the takeaway here. But at least for Lot and Jacob, it would have done them well if they were not near them in this case. Any other comments or questions? Yes. So I'm sorry. I am looking actively and I'm not seeing it. So I really appreciate the shout outs. Thank you.
You look at Shechem, look at Hamor, you look at the decisions,
Mm-hmm.
poor decisions
Yeah.
of the leader, right? And what happens when the perspective of that leader brings shame upon everyone if they are in charge of, right? So that's one. Two is, what was the other alternative for the sons of Jacob, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, sure, let's do a bargain, let's do a trade. And not even addressing what happened.
Yeah.
That could have happened. But we know that's not what happened. They're like, we're gonna defend and take retribution on what happened to our sister. You know, which was the right way to go? Which was the wrong way to go?
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, addressing an issue, maybe as harshly as it did, maybe wasn't great, but they addressed it immediately. And maybe it wasn't the right thing, but they showed the people of the land, you're not gonna mess with our family.
Yep.
So, you come back at us again, you're gonna get some more of that. So, either you're a bully, you're gonna bully me, here's what's gonna happen, you did right or wrong. So I can't say what was the right decision, but that shows the personality of that family. When you get involved with that family, what's gonna happen.
Yeah. It sends a very strong message. And speaking of that, I think the last two verses are very telling of Genesis 34. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, they being Simeon and Levi, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" So I find these verses very interesting. One, it's kind of a mic drop moment for Simeon and Levi, not saying their actions are okay, but it's a very valid question. Should he treat our sister like a prostitute? But we also see where Jacob's head is at in all of this, that Jacob is worried that the people are going to come and attack him because now he stinks to the people of the land. What I find very interesting about that is if you turn over to Genesis 35, one chapter over, not to tread on Steve's territory, but in Genesis 35, in verse 5, God has told them to get out of Shechem, go to Bethel. And in verse 5, and as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So what I struggle with here, I guess, is you see Jacob, I think he's thinking very carnally. He's not thinking very spiritually. He's not thinking of Yahweh here when he says this. He's thinking, well, they're going to come, they're going to attack me, and I'm not going to be able to stop them. But yet God has done so many great things in Jacob's life that he seems to be overlooking at this time. And I can't help but think about the application in my own life, where there's times where things might not be going the way I want to, and I overlook the times that God has helped me when things are bad and it all worked out okay. So any thoughts or questions on this? Because I am pretty much out of material, and I'm actively looking for hands. I see Steve. Yes, please.
Well,
Sorry.
it's interesting that when you started the class, Esau was afraid of his brother killing him. Now he lives with the fear that all the people of the land are going to kill him.
Yeah.
God says, "I will send my terror before you." And that's exactly what Rahab said when the spies came in, is the terror of the Lord was on the inhabitants of the land, so they feared God's people. So God is protecting them, but he's still conscious of his mortality.
Yes.
I was just thinking, I mean, this is totally as an aside, but in regards to leadership,
Mm-hmm.
that how many times in our current world will an entitled person, son of someone, be impulsive and then entitled to take what they want?
Yeah.
And then who has to deal with it? Their father steps in. And I think that's the thing with Hamor, at least give him a tiny bit of credit, that he's like, what can I do? You know, what was done can't be undone.
That's right.
Because she's defiled, and when she goes home, she's still spoiled. So, Hamor was saying, how can we make it right? And I mean, he was
And one of the things I wondered too about Hamor and his situation is it seems like there's several men with him, right? It seems like maybe his force outnumbers that of Jacob's. You know, could he have taken Dinah by force? I don't know. These are many. Yes.
I mean, he could have done it properly, but he seized her and took her.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions about Genesis 34 that there's just simply not answers to. Yes.
To piggyback off of Mr. Steve's point, we've seen not just with Esau, but Jacob has always functioned by fear, and that's what stimulates his deceit. He justifies his actions because he's fearful. Something's
Yeah.
going to happen to me, so I have the right to do this. And you look back at the story with Laban in 31 verse 31, then Jacob answered and said to Laban in response to why he stole his gods, because I was afraid, for I said, lest you would take your daughters from me by force. So we even see in that story, he's functioning by fear, and ironically there, he feared about his daughters.
Yeah.
You know, and then we see in this story, too, so just one example.
Yeah. Good point. Yes.
I also think just narratively, this is a really interesting story because we're seeing a common thread that's going to continue to be pulled for generations. If you make these tribes individuals, all of a sudden this is a story we could very easily read in Judges, right?
Yeah.
Like the imagery, the events that are taking place, and it's all rooted with the same names and the same people. So really what we're seeing is kind of the early days of how the roots into Canaan are going to drop this history and legacy of violence in God's people and his chosen people, all because they're choosing to be rooted and settled there.
That's right. Yes.
One thing that strikes me about this incident is kind of the incongruency of the crime and the reaction. What was done initially was terrible.
Yeah.
What would have been maybe a more measured response would have been for them to go in and take the offender's shepherd, not to murder everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that kind of shows sometimes when humans react to things, they overreact. Whether it's something
Yeah.
minor in our lives, like road rage or whatever, things like that, or feeling offended, and then we react in a certain way that's not right. Those minor things compared to what we're talking about in this incident, but the reaction was overwhelmingly, you know, improper and over the top.
That's right. Yes, Steve.
One thing that Josh had pointed out in the earlier classes was, what are the people that are reading this as Moses is writing it are thinking? And what we see is the conquest of Canaan coming, and God says, go in and slaughter all these people.
Mm-hmm.
They are a bad influence, they are ungodly, they have tested me for centuries, and it's time to get rid of them. So this is kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to take place and why. We see little snippets of, these aren't nice people. These people introduce God, foreign or pagan gods to the people of God. And God's going to say, when you inhabit the land, get rid of the inhabitants, eradicate them from the land. And this just shows us why, or gives us a glimpse of maybe.
Yeah. Yes. Last comment.
The other thing that I would say is we will see the Christian response to revenge later.
Yeah.
And really, it's not this is not satisfying to the children of Israel.
Yeah.
The idea that they did this exorbitant amount of force against a bunch of people who didn't do what Shechem's son did. But then Jesus is going to come around and say, just suffer the wrong. Just turn the other cheek. And that's going to be very dissatisfying as well.
Yeah.
Revenge is not usually something you need to be tinkering with.
Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Yep. All right. Genesis 35 next week. Thank you.